Winter came early in 1891, settling over the northern frontier before the last cabins were finished. The settlement stood thin and scattered along a frozen creek, its people preparing in the ways they always had. Logs were felled, notched, and stacked into walls meant to stand against snow and wind. Smoke holes were cut. Roof poles were dragged into place. It was familiar work, trusted work. 17-year-old Elias Morgan did none of it. While others raised their cabins above ground, Elias worked below it. On the edge of the clearing, he cut into the soil with a shovel worn smooth at the handle. The pit widened day by day, shallow at first, then deeper, until his shoulders dropped beneath the frost line. He said little about what he was building. Those who asked were told only that it would be warm. The idea drew attention quickly. Men paused in their hauling to watch him dig. A few laughed openly. An underground shelter was spoken of as something desperate trappers tried and abandoned, not something a boy planned to live in through winter. Elias's age was mentioned often, usually as explanation enough. Thomas Hale, the settlement's land assessor, addressed it directly. Hale was responsible for recording claims and improvements, and he had little patience for deviations. He stood at the edge of the pit one afternoon, boots crusted with snow, and told Elias that a proper cabin was visible proof of settlement. A hole in the ground, he said, proved nothing. Elias listened without argument. He kept digging. By late autumn, the mockery had spread. Neighbors spoke of cave-ins, damp air, and sickness. One man remarked that snow buried cabins every year, and people survived. Another suggested the boy would come begging for space beside a stove before the season turned hard. The comments were made within hearing distance, rarely addressed to Elias directly. If this account has value, it is worth following such details. Those who find this record useful may choose to note it, share it, or return for similar accounts. The work itself continues regardless. The ground resisted as temperatures fell. Each morning, the shovel struck harder soil, and Elias had to break ice before he could remove earth. His hands cracked despite gloves. At night, he slept in a borrowed loft, rising before light to return to the pit. He measured depth by the length of his ladder, not by instruments. Above him, the settlement took shape in timber. Cabins stood square and visible, their roofs angled to shed snow. The contrast was obvious. Where others built walls to keep winter out, Elias placed earth between himself and the air. No one stopped him. The land allowed it, and youth often earned indulgence. Still, the laughter carried a warning. Winters here were not endured lightly. Storms arrived without notice. Temperatures killed livestock in hours. Survival was not a matter of clever ideas, but of proven methods. As November closed, the first heavy snow fell. It settled into the pit overnight, filling it halfway before Elias returned at dawn to clear it. He worked in silence, breath steaming, the sound of digging muffled by the earth around him. The winter ahead was not spoken of as a challenge. It was treated as a fact, approaching, indifferent to opinion. By early November, Elias Morgan's work was no longer treated as a private oddity. It became a subject of regular mention whenever settlers gathered for supplies, measurements, or simple rest. The pit near the clearing was now deep enough that only the top of his ladder showed above ground, and that fact alone unsettled people who had chosen to build upward. Thomas Hale returned more than once. As land assessor, he carried a small ledger and the habit of writing while standing. He noted dimensions, locations, and improvements that could be seen. When he came to Elias's site, he wrote less. He asked where the walls would stand, how smoke would escape, and whether drainage had been considered. Elias answered briefly, pointing to timbers stacked nearby and a narrow trench cut downslope. Hale recorded none of it. Two neighboring homesteaders watched with similar concern. Samuel Brooks, who had raised cabins in 2 territories before this one, remarked that earth held cold as well as heat. He spoke from experience, not malice. Henry Cutter, younger but cautious, noted that spring melt drowned poorly placed dugouts. Their comments were shared while passing, tools still in hand, voices kept level. The elderly widow, Margaret Hale, said nothing. She lived alone in a small cabin set back from the creek and walked the settlement slowly. When she passed the pit, she stopped and looked down for a time, hands folded in her shawl. No record exists of her speaking to Elias, but she returned often enough to be noticed. As days shortened, the conversations repeated themselves. Snow cover deepened, then crusted. The sound of digging grew sharper as frozen soil fractured instead of yielding. Elias's pace slowed, but he did not change direction. The settlement began to treat his effort as an example, discussed openly, almost formally. One afternoon, Hale spoke where others could hear. He said the shelter might be acceptable as storage, but not as a dwelling through winter. Brooks agreed that smoke would be a problem. Cutter added that frost heave crushed shallow walls. Elias listened, resting both hands on the shovel handle, then returned to work without reply. Such exchanges entered memory because they were ordinary. No one raised a voice. No one tried to stop him. Doubt did not require force. It required repetition. By the second week of November, the judgment was settled. The underground shelter was regarded as insufficient and its builder too young to know better. For those following this account, a brief pause is appropriate. If these records are of use, they may be noted, shared, or followed as they continue. The events themselves move forward regardless. No meeting was called, and no vote taken. The settlement functioned by habit, and habit favored what could be seen standing upright against snow. Elias's work, hidden by design, remained easy to dismiss, and that dismissal spread quietly, carried by shared glances and repeated remarks. It settled into common belief without formal decision or recorded objection. Soon after, the weather shifted again. Wind came down from the ridges and stayed. Cabins creaked as they cooled overnight. Smoke hung low and failed to rise. Elias began fitting roof beams below ground, working by lantern light even at midday. The widow watched from a distance. Hale passed without stopping. Doubt, once spoken, required no further comment. It had been entered into the public record by repetition and consent. The season advanced, and with it came the quiet understanding that proof would arrive not through argument, but through weather. By mid-November, the shelter had passed from curiosity into labor. Elias Morgan no longer worked where most could see him. The pit walls rose above his head, and sound carried poorly from below. Only the steady scrape of metal against earth marked his progress, rising faintly through the opening. The soil changed with depth. Loose top layers gave way to packed clay mixed with stone. Each foot downward required more effort than the last. Elias widened the floor first, then squared the walls by hand, cutting straight faces where the earth allowed and shoring weaker sections as soon as they showed strain. He worked slowly, knowing collapse would not announce itself in advance. Timber bracing came next. Logs cut earlier in the season were lowered by rope and set vertically along the walls. Crosspieces were fitted tight, notched with a saw dulled from use. Gaps were filled with packed soil and gravel carried in buckets. The work was repetitive and exacting. Errors would not be visible until it was too late to correct them. Ventilation required more thought. A narrow shaft was cut upward at an angle, opening beyond the prevailing wind. It was lined with split boards and sealed where frost might creep in. A second opening was marked, but left unfinished, reserved for smoke once a fire could be set safely below. Elias measured by sight and habit, not tools. Drainage followed. A shallow channel was cut from the lowest point of the floor toward a gravel bed outside the shelter. It sloped gently, enough to carry meltwater away without weakening the walls. Elias tested it by pouring buckets through the channel, watching how the water moved, where it slowed, where it pooled. Adjustments were made in silence. He did not work entirely alone. On some mornings, a quiet friend from the settlement arrived without announcement. Together they moved timbers and hauled soil. Few words were exchanged. Tasks were understood. When the work was done, the friend left, leaving no comment behind. A draft horse was used when loads grew too heavy. The animal stood patient at the edge of the pit, harness creaking as weight shifted. Soil buckets rose and fell on a simple rig. The horse required care and rest, adding another measure to the workday. Elias adjusted his pace to match it. Weather pressed steadily. Daylight shortened until most work occurred by lantern. The ground at the surface froze solid, and digging above became impossible. Below, the temperature remained stable, but moisture gathered on tools and clothing. Elias's hands stayed numb even when the air felt still. Food was simple and taken quickly. Fatigue accumulated without drama. Some nights he slept below ground, testing the space as it formed, listening for movement in the walls. None came. Still, he marked stress points with charcoal, checking them each morning before work resumed. Snow began to fill the entrance faster than it could be cleared. Elias raised the opening with boards and packed earth, creating a collar above the surface. It narrowed the access, but kept the interior clear. Each change responded to pressure rather than preference. By the end of the week, the shelter had taken shape as a place rather than a hole. Walls stood firm under load. Air moved where it was meant to. Water drained away. Nothing about it suggested comfort, but it suggested endurance. The frost line lay above him now, and the work continued beneath it. Measured not in ideas, but in what held. As Elias Morgan continued his work below the surface, life in the settlement advanced in its customary direction. Cabins now stood completed, or nearly so. Their squared logs fitted tight at the corners, chinking pressed into the seams. Roofs were weighted with poles and stones. Each structure followed patterns carried from earlier places, built to be seen, counted, and recognized as sufficient. Smoke rose most mornings, though it rarely climbed far. Cold air held it low, spreading it across the clearing before wind pushed it aside. Doors froze overnight and had to be forced open. Axes rang less often now, replaced by the steady work of sealing gaps and stacking fuel close to walls. Thomas Hale resumed his rounds with greater frequency. He measured completed cabins and recorded improvements with care. When he reached Elias's site, his attention remained above ground. He noted the raised collar around the entrance and the narrowed opening. He said, within hearing of others, that underground work complicated inspection and offered little protection if snow drifted deep enough to block exit. His tone was formal, consistent with his role, and he stayed only long enough to record his remarks. 2 cabins near the creek became points of reference. Samuel Brooks's structure stood solid, its roof pitched steeply, its stove newly set. Henry Cutter's cabin was smaller, built quickly, but followed accepted practice. Both men had families to consider. Each added layers of bark and soil against the outer walls as the cold deepened. A child moved between these cabins, carrying kindling too small to be trusted to stay dry on its own. The child's work was supervised, corrected, and repeated. Gloves were tied at the wrist to keep them from being lost. No one spoke of danger, but each task was done with an awareness of exposure. Margaret Hale's cabin remained unchanged. It was low, set back from the main clearing, and already shadowed most of the day. She gathered snow for water and split it near the door so she would not need to carry it far. When she walked, her steps were careful, deliberate. She paused often, resting without complaint. When she passed Elias's shelter, she still looked down, then moved on. Snow began to arrive in layers rather than flurries. What fell did not melt. Drifts formed against the north sides of cabins and hardened overnight. Paths had to be cleared twice a day to remain passable. The creek narrowed as ice crept inward from the banks, leaving only a dark ribbon of moving water. Inside the cabins, space grew smaller. Firewood occupied corners meant for tools. Bedding was moved closer to stoves. The sound of wind became constant, pressing against walls and slipping through joints despite the chinking. At night, timbers contracted sharply, making sounds that woke sleepers without warning. Talk returned to Elias more often as conditions worsened. It was noted that his shelter would be hard to abandon if something went wrong. Others pointed out that cabins could be repaired from inside, while Earth could not. These comments carried no urgency. They were observations, made while hands worked and eyes followed familiar tasks. One afternoon, Hale addressed the matter again, this time briefly. He said that in his records, permanent dwellings were understood to be above ground. He added that deviation from common practice often led to unnecessary risk. Elias was not present. The statement was received without reply. By the end of the week, snow covered the lower halves of several cabins. Windows admitted less light. Children were kept indoors longer. The settlement adapted by narrowing its movements and lowering its expectations. No one spoke of leaving. Winter was not treated as a trial to be overcome, but as a condition to be endured. Below ground, Elias's shelter remained unseen. Above it, the settlement stood as it always had, exposed to weather and reliant on what could be stacked, burned, and sealed in time. Snow continued to fall earlier each day, accumulating without pause. The structures held for now, and the people adjusted their routines accordingly, waiting for the season to show what those routines were worth. The cold front arrived without clear beginning. One morning followed another with lower temperatures, and no day brought relief. The air thickened, holding stillness between gusts that came sharp and brief. By the third day, breath froze on beards before it could fall away, and exposed skin burned within minutes. The settlement responded as it had learned to respond. Cabin doors were opened less often. Snow was packed higher against outer walls, not for insulation, but to block wind that forced itself through every seam. Chinking cracked and had to be pressed again by hand, fingers stiff and uncooperative. Nails shrank loose in frozen timber and were driven back in with care, as splitting the wood now meant weakness later. Fuel stores became the measure of safety. Firewood was moved indoors wherever space allowed, stacked close enough to stoves to dry but not close enough to catch. Smaller pieces were separated for quick heat in the mornings, larger logs saved for nights when fires could not be allowed to fade. Rations were discussed quietly and adjusted without formal agreement. Meals shortened, fat was saved, flour was measured more carefully. Wind loads increased as snow accumulated on roofs. Poles were added where weight sagged timbers downward. Brooks climbed his roof twice in 1 week, clearing drifts before they hardened. Cutter did the same, working in stages, retreating often to warm his hands. Each effort carried risk, but delay carried more. The child remained indoors except when necessary. Tasks were brought inside. Kindling split near the stove. Water melted rather than carried. Margaret Hale ventured out only once a day, timing her movements between gusts. When she returned, she closed her door slowly, as if sound itself might draw cold inside. Thomas Hale continued his rounds, though more briefly. He noted frost damage and fuel levels, recording what could be recorded. His comments focused on preparation and supply, not design. The underground shelter was not mentioned. There was little value in revisiting it while conditions pressed from all sides. Below ground, Elias Morgan worked through the same days without interruption. The cold front registered differently there. Temperature remained steady, but dampness increased. Moisture condensed along timbers and collected at joints. Elias addressed it by adding layers of bark and soil where air moved too freely. He sealed gaps with clay warmed between his hands until it could be pressed firm. The final roof supports were set during this period. Heavy beams were placed across the shelter, notched into vertical posts and wedged tight. Earth was packed above them in layers, each one tamped down before the next was added. The work was slow and exacting. Mistakes could not be corrected once buried. Ventilation was finished last. Elias extended the secondary shaft and capped it against snow with a simple hood. He tested airflow by lighting a small flame and watching its movement. Smoke drew upward as intended. He extinguished the fire quickly, unwilling to waste fuel. Food supplies were moved below in stages. Nothing perishable was left above ground longer than necessary. Bedding followed, then tools. The ladder was reinforced, its rungs wrapped to improve grip. The entrance was narrowed again, sacrificing ease of access for protection against drift. Above, the settlement entered a holding pattern. Days blended together, marked only by fire cycles and the need to clear snow. Sound traveled poorly in the cold. A dropped tool carried farther than a shouted word. People learned to conserve movement as well as fuel. By the end of the week, the cold front showed no sign of lifting. Weather had made its decision, and the settlement adjusted accordingly. Cabins stood, though under strain. Fires burned constantly. Supplies diminished at a predictable rate. Nothing catastrophic had occurred, but nothing improved. Elias finished his shelter during this period, not with ceremony, but by stopping. There came a point when no further work increased its strength. He rested below ground that night, listening to wind pass over earth instead of through it. Above him, snow continued to fall, adding weight to roofs and narrowing paths. The season had settled in, and survival now depended less on preparation than on how those preparations endured. As the cold front settled, the storm followed without warning. Snow began falling in the early hours and did not stop when daylight came. Wind rose steadily, driving fine ice through every gap it could find. By the first night, the settlement was already enclosed, paths erased as quickly as they were cleared. Cabins absorbed the pressure unevenly. Roofs carried weight meant to slide away, not remain. Brooks cleared his twice on the first day, then once more before dark. During the night, drifting snow rebuilt what he had removed. By morning, one corner beam sagged enough to crack its joint. He braced it from inside, reducing living space to keep the roof standing. Cutter's smaller cabin fared worse. Snow packed against the door until it would not open outward. He exited through a window, widening the opening with an axe until the frame splintered. Cold entered freely after that. He hung blankets across the gap, accepting heat loss in exchange for access. Margaret Hale's cabin grew silent. Smoke no longer rose from its pipe by the second day. Snow drifted high against her door, sealing it shut. No one could reach her through the wind, and no one attempted to call out. Sound carried nowhere. The child remained indoors with Brooks, their tasks reduced to tending fire and watching ice creep along the walls. By the third day, structural failures became visible. One roof collapsed under accumulated weight, dropping snow and timbers into the room below. No one was inside at the time. The cabin was abandoned immediately, its contents lost beneath the debris. Another cabin lost its chimney when shifting ice cracked the stone base. Smoke filled the interior, forcing its occupants out until the fire died. Movement outside became dangerous. Wind knocked men from their footing. Snow concealed drop-offs and hardened into crust that cut through boots. Efforts shifted from preservation to endurance. Fires were kept low to conserve fuel. Food was eaten cold to avoid wasting heat on cooking. Thomas Hale attempted one round on the second day and then stopped. Records could wait. Survival required stillness. He sheltered with Brooks and Cutter, sharing what space remained. Conversation ceased, except when necessary. Each man listened for changes in sound that might signal failure. Below ground, Elias Morgan experienced the storm as pressure rather than violence. Wind passed overhead without entering the shelter. Snow accumulated above, compressing earth against the roof beams. Inside, the temperature held. Moisture increased, dripping slowly from timbers until channels guided it away. He tended a small fire, keeping it low and constant. Smoke drew through the shaft as tested, never backing into the space. Bedding remained dry. Food supplies stayed accessible. Time was measured by fire cycles and the need to clear the entrance shaft from below as snow compacted above it. At intervals, Elias pressed his hand against the walls, feeling for movement. None came. The shelter responded to weight by settling further into the ground, tightening rather than loosening. Sound from the surface was absent. The storm announced itself only when snow filtered down the ladder shaft, prompting him to clear it. The blizzard lasted 4 days. When it ended, it did not fade gently. Wind ceased, leaving heavy silence. Above ground, cabins stood damaged and buried, some unrecognizable beneath drifted snow. Doors remained blocked. Roofs sagged permanently. Smoke did not rise from every chimney. Elias emerged after clearing the shaft fully. The surface was altered, familiar shapes erased. He moved carefully, noting collapse, blockage, and absence without comment. The shelter behind him remained intact, its entrance marked only by a low mound and packed earth. Survival revealed itself through condition rather than declaration. Those who endured did so where structure allowed it. Those whose cabins failed adapted or retreated. The storm passed judgment without voice, leaving its evidence in wood, snow, and what still stood. No one spoke of causes or blame in those hours. Attention remained fixed on immediate needs, on clearing airways and restoring heat. The blizzard was understood as an event, not an enemy. Its impact was measured by what endured after it moved on. Nothing else was required to explain the outcome that followed afterward. Morning returned without light at first. Cloud thinned gradually, allowing a pale brightness to settle over the buried settlement. Wind did not return. What remained was stillness and weight. Snow lay deep enough to alter distances and flatten landmarks, forcing survivors to move slowly and reorient themselves by memory rather than sight. Men emerged where they could. Doors were cut free or climbed through. Windows became exits. Roof lines were inspected before anyone stood beneath them. No one spoke beyond what was necessary to coordinate effort. Damage was assessed by touch and sound. by pressure against beams, and the way snow shifted when weight was added. Brooks cleared a path to his remaining doorway and checked the brace he had set days earlier. It held, though the roof sagged permanently. Cutter widened his broken window further, deciding it would serve as an entrance for the rest of winter. Smoke rose unevenly as fires were relit, some drawing poorly, others not at all. Margaret Hale's cabin was reached last. Snow was cut away from the door and pushed aside until it could be opened inward. She was alive, seated near the stove, fuel nearly gone. She was brought outside briefly to breathe clear air, then returned. No explanation was given, and none was requested. The collapsed cabin remained where it had fallen. Its timbers were visible in places, broken and twisted. No attempt was made to recover what lay beneath. The chimneyless structure was entered only long enough to retrieve tools left near the door. The rest was left to freeze. Attention shifted, gradually, toward the low mound at the edge of the clearing. Elias Morgan stood beside it, clearing snow from the entrance collar with steady movements. The shelter emerged intact. No walls had shifted. No roofline sagged. Smoke rose cleanly from the vent once a small fire was lit inside. Comparison required no comment. The shelter was measured against what stood and what had failed. It had remained dry. It had remained warm enough. Access had not been lost. These facts were visible without explanation. Thomas Hale approached last. He walked the perimeter, noted the condition of surrounding cabins, then stepped closer to the shelter. He looked down into the entrance, and then at the roofline, now revealed as packed earth rather than timber. He asked how deep it had been set. Elias answered with a number, no more. Hale nodded once. He made a brief note in his ledger. There was no apology offered and no praise recorded. Only acknowledgement, delivered without expression, that the shelter had performed as a dwelling through the storm. Work resumed across the settlement. Snow was cleared where possible. Fires were tended. Paths were re-established. The shelter remained in use, its condition unchanged by attention. Evidence had been gathered by weather, not argument. Morning moved forward, and the settlement adjusted its understanding accordingly. Years later, the settlement no longer stood as it once had. Cabins had been replaced, moved or abandoned as families shifted and boundaries changed. The creek still ran, narrower now, and the land carried fewer markers of its first winter. What remained most clearly was not a structure, but a record. In county ledgers and survey notes, Elias Morgan's name appeared briefly and without emphasis. He was listed as a claimant, then as an owner, and later not at all. The underground shelter received no title and no description beyond its measurements. Decades passed, and building practices in the area adjusted quietly. Cabins were still built, but more were set into banks, hillsides, and cut slopes. Foundations were lowered, roofs reinforced, and entrances turned away from prevailing wind. No meeting recorded the change, and no one credited a single event. A man who had been a child that winter spoke of it once, years later, when asked. He described the storm, the buried cabins, and the shelter that held. He did not praise its builder or call the design clever. He said only that it had been enough. By then, Elias Morgan was known through paperwork rather than memory. There were no stories told about his youth or his digging. The shelter itself collapsed long after it was abandoned, returning to earth without notice. It left no marker, no plaque, and no trace that could be pointed to. What endured was the adjustment that followed. People built with more soil and less exposure, without stating why. The shelter was remembered, when it was remembered at all, as sufficient. That assessment outlasted opinion, explanation, and the winter itself. It required no defense and invited no imitation beyond what proved useful. In records that followed, survival was measured by outcome, not intention. The shelter entered those records only as evidence of endurance. Years later, that remained its final description. The land continued to weather storms without regard for method or belief. Those who stayed learned quietly, and those who came later inherited the result. Elias Morgan's shelter was part of that inheritance, unnamed and uncelebrated. It had done what it was meant to do, and nothing more. In that, it matched the frontier's standard for success. It remained as a fact, not a story. Enough to last, enough to be recorded, and enough to be left behind. That was its measure alone.